Welcome back, everyone. I'm Joy Purdy here outside the federal courthouse. Thanks for continuing to stay with us for the news at 4 o'clock. Inside right now on the stand of Corrine Brown's corruption trial is her tax preparer. We have also heard today from Carla Wiley. She is the president of the questionable foundation One Door for Education, as well as Vaughn Alexander, who became a very good friend to Corrine Brown. Vaughn Alexander had her own PR agency. All of these people giving very damaging testimony inside federal court, but has it been enough to really prove fraud on Corrine Brown's part? Right now, we're going to go back into the studio with Kent Justice. He is with some other attorneys who are going to give us a little bit more insight. Kent?
Yeah, thank you, Joy. Yeah, another day of testimony that paints a rather poor picture of the defendant in this case, Congresswoman Brown. So here to remind us that we haven't heard both sides yet, Rhonda Peoples Waters, a local defense attorney, and Curtis Fallgatter, defense attorney now, but former federal prosecutor. So it's kind of tough to tell. Why don't you lead off here? Whose testimony is more damaging, I guess?
Well, certainly I was in the courtroom and was able to hear Vaughn Alexander's testimony. I think that she was more of a friend to Corrine today, because her testimony continued to reiterate that although she made the deposits into Corrine Brown's account, that she was told that it was for reimbursement, that Ronnie was supposed to give her the documentation of what the expenses were for. So she placed a lot of that blame on Ronnie, but she certainly said, I made the deposits because Corrine told me she needed to be reimbursed.
Curtis Fallgatter, is that kind of the missing element? You can make these deposits, but Vaughn Alexander isn't saying Corrine Brown knew all the time this was fraud.
Well, of course, she can't say that. I mean, the overlying requirement of the government's prosecution is they got to prove that Ms. Brown knows that the whole one-door operation was a fraud. A separate issue is money got to her, and happens to be in sort of a nominee type of payment. You know, if she's earned it, if it's reimbursement, you know, that's a valid reimbursement to someone that's a spokeswoman for the organization. But even if the money comes to her, the government still has to prove that Ms. Brown was aware that there was an overarching fraud of which she was a part, and not trickery by Ronnie Simmons and Carla Wiley.
And so what we've seen in this about a week of the trial so far, has that happened yet? Have we seen it proven that Corrine Brown knew there was fraud going on?
I have not seen it. And of course, the two key witnesses, Carla Wiley and Mr. Simmons, they have collectively about 80 pages of plea agreements with the government, and there's not one word in there where they say, we told Ms. Brown we were defrauding the donors. And if they're not going to say it, who can?
Yeah, what do you think, Rhonda?
And I also think it's interesting from Carla Wiley's testimony today is that she was basically using the money for her personal benefit. Then she was also admitting that she used the money for her and for Ronnie's benefit. But you can see there that Corrine was kind of left out of that usage. And I think that that definitely falls into Corrine's favor, that they personally used that money, and Corrine had no knowledge of their use of that money.
So let me ask both of you to weigh in on this. I think one of the things that stands out to people who are just hearing this is nonprofit, raised a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we hear from the government that, well, they just gave out one scholarship or a little bit of money, you know, a couple $1,000s maybe. Isn't that fraud to start with?
Well, only if you know about it. I mean, Ms. Brown has no clue as to what's being spent and who's got scholarships. She doesn't get quarterly reports or annual reports, so she's in the dark about that, intentionally so. Plus, I think the evidence is that she was aware of some $50,000 being spent on sending kids to China, which is really the true purpose of the One Door, this international ambassadorship. So she's aware of that, but she's not an accountant and she doesn't get any reports. So how does she know how the money's being spent?
Okay, all right, what do you think?
And there's also the inauguration trip of almost $90,000. We heard today that there was the foreclosure monies that were utilized, somewhat tied into this One Door money. So there were definitely other usages besides what we've heard from the government.
Regardless of whether they're scholarship, it might have been used for these purposes. It might have been the real purpose of One Door for Education. All of this is going to continue as we continue hearing testimony in this case. And again, this is just the prosecution. Defense is still to come. Joy, back to you.
Ken, thank you. Folks, we have been giving you just the highlights of what has happened today. Coming up at 5 o'clock in the 5 o'clock newscast, we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of this case, the testimony inside. Who are these friends turned informants that are now testifying against Corrine Brown? Her attorneys, they tried to poke holes into the testimony. We're going to get into all of that. Jim Pickett will join me live, as well as our local attorney, Randy Reep, to give us his insight. So be sure to join us starting at 5 tonight. Tarek, we're going to send it back to you. All right.